Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News. Yesterday, legendary Skull Island suddenly came together in a big way, pun intended. Skull Island, of course, is going to be Legendary's third kaiju property after Pacific Rim and then Godzilla, Skull Island being the home of King Kong. And this is one of the better received announcements to come out of Comic-Con 2014. It's a little ways off, but suddenly we can see it on the horizon because Legendary has announced both the director and the star. And let's talk about the star first because this is where it just gets into fanboy heaven and fangirl heaven, and that's that Tom Hiddleston will play the lead. How great for Tom Hiddleston. He must be such a likable guy because Marvel and Disney Marvel uses him so much over in their sandbox, and now Legendary is doubling down with him after Crimson Peak. Thomas Tull must be like, I just like having Tom around. Let's sign him up for Skull Island and just keep him here. And Marvel's like, hey, he's our friend. But I'm sure they can share. Although Loki is taking a little bit of a back seat after some would say he was got to be a little overexposed due to his intense popularity. So he's going to be the lead in Skull Island, and the director is going to be the director from The Kings of Summer. This is a very small indie film. I want to make sure I pronounce his name right. So it's, let's see here. It's Jordan Vogt Roberts. He's an interesting choice. Again, this is the kind of choice that makes me very nervous because, well, the Russo brothers, James Gunn, Joss Whedon even have been able to jump right into the deep end of the pool when it comes to these special effects heavy or visual effects heavy blockbusters. Sometimes they don't, they kind of do a belly flop because we've had Gareth Edwards, I feel, didn't quite transition that well in terms of, pacing was a real problem for him. I think maybe he overreached. And Mark Webb, while at first he seemed to really do a great job relaunching the Spider-Man franchise, it seems his web seems to have kind of dissolved all around him with the second entry. So it's tricky, and it seems if you don't have the Marvel framework to support you, it can be a very difficult leap to make. And, I always say that I don't like seeing these actors practice on the big movies. Let them practice somewhere else on a mid-range film because that's why, recently someone's question here was, why are sequels always better? And I said that was a contributing factor, that you have your director learning the ropes on the first film and then they can really deliver on the second film, which to me is a silly way to run things. But anyway, they feel over at Legendary that this guy's going to do a great job with Skull Island, based off the small little coming-of-age Stand By Me type movie he made, which is, again, an interesting choice. But Gareth Edwards, Godzilla did make a lot of money, and Gareth Edwards has gone on to get a Star Wars gig. So it turned out pretty good. Now, for Tom Hiddleston, this is great news because I think he's finally getting an opportunity to move away from Loki. He is in Crimson Peak, but there he has kind of a similar look to Loki with black hair again. He's seemingly evil, whatever, etc. Same thing. And while I realize that in his indie films he's shown some other sides to him, that hasn't really gotten a lot of exposure. So to see him land the Skull Island gig, and then also this Hank Williams movie that he's making where he plays the legendary country singer, opposite, by the way, Elizabeth Olsen, who's also a genre staple at this point, thanks to her role in Godzilla and the upcoming Avengers Age of Ultron. But these are, I think, roles that are going to take him out of the realm of Loki and show him maybe what he can do as an actual actor. Now, this, again, a little iffy, because in all these indie films Tom Hiddleston has made, none of them have really stood out. If any of these performances really were remarkable, they would have made the jump to the mainstream. But instead, they just kind of hung out in the indie world. So this is a test for Tom Hiddleston. I'm glad he's getting the opportunity, and I really am rooting for him because I like him quite a bit. Not only his acting, the work that he does as Loki, some of the other small things that I've seen him in, but also he just seems like a really nice guy, a real team player. Of course, he famously showed up to Comic-Con, not this year, but last year as Loki, and it is still, I think, one of the great Comic-Con moments of all time. And so kudos to him for being able for being willing to participate in that, as many actors have so seldom been willing to do. But before we move on to the next story, something else I wanted to point out is that it looks like we're finally seeing a change in how other directors and producers view talent associated with these comic book movies. As you might recall, there was a time where when you did one of these big blockbuster popcorn movies, it was hard to convince a small film or an ambitious film to take a chance on you. But that does not seem to be the case anymore. Tom Hiddleston's getting this Hank Williams role. Chris Evans has a trailer out for this movie called Playing It Cool, which is like this intellectual romantic comedy. He just came off of Snowpiercer, and if Chris Evans can suddenly become a box office and a commercial critical commodity after he was for so long, any movie that he was in was immediately written off by everyone. That just shows the power of the Marvel brand, and that it's creating these actors who, once they go through the house of Marvel, they are established in not only really strong properties that are very well regarded by everyone, but also they establish, I think, a strong connection with the audience. The audience likes them. They want to see more of them, and I think that's a little bit of what's going on here as well. So very interesting, and will Marvel come to regret letting Loki take a breather? So that's the first story of the day. The second story of the day also has to do with Marvel, and it has to do with something we've discussed a lot here on Beyond the Trailer, and that's, can a character simultaneously exist in film and television? And will they be played by different actors, or will the same actor play both roles? And this is actually rearing its head in a very interesting way with the character of Jarvis. It was just announced that James D'Arcy, you saw him in Cloud Atlas, he's done a lot of small films, he's a UK actor, will be playing the role of Jarvis on Agent Carter, Howard Stark's butler. That raises a ton of interesting questions about Jarvis. I'll get to that in a moment, but I think it's very interesting and very telling that Paul Bettany isn't playing the role. Why wouldn't he if it's modeled on him? I mean, I guess they're just going to say that Ultron created a different face for him that happens to look like Paul Bettany, because there's enough of a similarity between James D'Arcy and Paul Bettany that you can see that they're trying to have him play the same character. But to all of you who say, hey, there's no stigma against TV, film actors should be willing to do it, why do you think that when Samuel L. Jackson and Colby Smulders and even Jamie Alexander have gone from the movies to the small screen, why do you think Paul Bettany isn't willing to do it? I just think that's very interesting to me that he wouldn't go in. It's only an 8-episode commitment to Agent Carter for this first season. It's going to be a fill-in for S.H.I.E.L.D. while S.H.I.E.L.D. takes a break in, I believe, January. But I think it's very telling. And we'll see if audiences find it confusing. Now, they're obviously going to be playing Jarvis at different points. This is the flesh and blood version of Jarvis. But here's where it gets interesting. If Jarvis was actually a flesh and blood person that was Howard Stark's butler, and conceivably Tony Stark was somewhat raised by him, a la Alfred and Bruce Wayne a little bit, is this the brain waves of Jarvis downloaded into a computer, kind of like Transcendence with Johnny Depp, or is this an AI that just kind of tips its hat to James D'Arcy's real-life Jarvis? I think that's a very interesting question. And either way, especially though, if it's the brain waves downloaded into the computer, why not preserve your dad? Why not preserve Howard Stark? I think it's a really interesting question, and we'll see how it's explored. But I'm very curious to what you guys think of this. We're going to have our first test. Aside from Alfred, I guess it's interesting. We're going with the butlers first. You're going to have we've discussed before, an Alfred on the Fox's Gotham show, but then also an Alfred in the Batman v Superman played by Jeremy Irons. And now here you're having two Jarvises, one played by Paul Bettany on the silver screen, and one played by James D'Arcy on the small screen. So I'm very curious to what you guys think, and also if you think this is an idea worth pursuing, or while it might on the surface seem like just an effort to kind of tie everything together in a fun way, does it actually raise more questions than it's worth? All right, so that's the second story of the day. Now, the third story, oh, by the way, I'll bring this up really fast. I had a note here to mention it. The Howling Commandos will also be featured heavily in Agent Carter, and we were wondering if they were ever going to get some FaceTime, some much-needed FaceTime after Cap went to the future. All right, so the third story of the day is about True Detective. Now, we've talked a lot about the male casting for the second season. True Detective turned out to be an incredibly valuable asset to Matthew McConaughey. I strongly feel it helped him win the Oscar because it was airing when the voters were voting for the Oscars, and I just really helped. It was, I would say, even more so than Dallas Buyers Club, it was the pinnacle of the McConaissance. So now after some criticism about not having a strong female role, it's been written into the second season that there'll be a couple of, won't just be two lead roles anymore. There'll be a couple of characters, and one will be a woman. Now, the male characters are rumored to be Colin Farrell and Taylor Kitsch, and then Vince Vaughn in some sort of role. And this is going to be Chinatown, basically, out in California or the West Coast, but instead of dealing with conspiracies about a water pipeline or access to water, it's going to be about a high-speed railway system that's supposed to change public transportation in the state. So the female character is going to be a sheriff who's a heavy gambler and drinker thanks to an abusive childhood. Seems a little cliche, but then I think there were some cliche aspects to some of the characterizations in True Detective Season 1, and the actors were able to do amazing things with that. So who is going to join the cast, and will they be able to have the same kind of resurgence in their career as the male actors have had? And I mean, I think there are a lot of female actresses out there who could use the help. Now, the initial frontrunners were Elizabeth Moss from Mad Men, who I think would be a pretty good choice, but you know, it's more television for her. And then I think one of the great things about True Detective is bringing film-level actors to television. And then also Rachel McAdams. But apparently, you know, she's very well known for The Notebook, etc. And I always find it funny because guys in particular just love Rachel McAdams. So she might be a good choice. But for some reason, those two actresses aren't gelling with the role. So they're continuing to test. And they have a very interesting, but I would say also somewhat disappointing list of actresses. Now, the frontrunner besides these two is Rosario Dawson, who we all know is also on Netflix's Daredevil. So that's a lot of TV for her, and I think that might be what's holding HBO back from casting her, and that they don't want to give too much attention to their competition over at Netflix or pull away from their own project. Then Jessica Biel is also up for the role, Malin Ackerman from Watchmen, and Jamie Alexander, aka Sif. And then there's even a third tier of actresses being considered, and that's Britt Marling. She's a very prolific indie actress who also happens to be a writer-director. Kelly Riley, she was Denzel Washington's love interest in Flight Plan, you might recall her. And then Una Chaplin, who is an actual chaplain, and she was Robb Stark's wife on Game of Thrones, who, of course, was part of the infamous Red Wedding. Now, I would love to see one of these actresses do an amazing job with the role and, you know, really surprise us. And, you know, emphasis on surprise, because that's what I think's wrong with this casting list. Colin Farrell fits the mold. Taylor Kitsch fits the mold. Vince Vaughn definitely fits the mold of rehabilitating an actor's career that's broken, a film actor's career. But I don't see that here. You know, all these other actors were once considered greats, but I don't think really anyone on this list is considered a great actress. I would rather see someone like, you know, Renee Russo, for instance, who's getting a second chance in Nightcrawler. You know, she was considered at one point a really great actress. You know, find a Deborah Winger type actress, you know, that famous documentary about women not being able to find roles as they get older, whereas men, well, you know, the feeling is that men continue to work, but I think Christopher Nolan has done a great job by casting some looked over actors that it's just as hard for men to transition as they get older as well. You know, Tom Berenger, etc. Those Steve Guttenberg, Matthew Modine. Nolan didn't hire Guttenberg, but he should have. He's on that list as well. But that's what I would like to see. I think all these actresses, they just scream ingenue to me, and that the role isn't being taken as seriously as the male counterparts. But I'm curious to what you think. Are any of these actresses exciting to you? Do you think any of them fits the mold, fits the True Detective formula? And who would you like to see cast out of this list? All right, so let's get on to the viewer question. This is from Liros, and Liros says, question: what do you think of the movement of comic book live-action TV series? We've been talking about this a lot here on the show. How do you feel about the hypothetical X-Men live-action series, and do you think it will succeed where the movies fail to capture the X-Men spirit? How about comics that didn't get a chance on any other media? For instance, comics like Y the Last Man, or Academy X, or even my comic, the one that I wrote, Superbia. Thank you for thinking of me, Liros, and I'm very happy you checked out my comic. And then which comic, in your opinion, would fit the most? Hope you'll have a wonderful day, Naor. I hope you have a wonderful day too, Naor, and it's a great question because we really are starting to see a surge in comic book properties on the small screen as well as the big screen. You have Gotham, Flash, Constantine, The Arrow continuing over in DC. They just announced a Titans show for TNT, and then of course Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter over from Marvel. Now, what do I think should be the reasoning for going to TV? I think it should be, you know, an emphasis on when the story has benefited the most from the episodic nature of television storytelling, not a way to cover more characters. For instance, I think Y the Last Man that Naor mentioned would be a fantastic television series. However, it might seem a little bit too much like The Walking Dead at this point because they're both like post-apocalyptic worlds, but I think it would be a great television series. And I think it would be hard to do that story because it went for so long in a movie. But for the X-Men, I think the X-Men really need to stay on the big screen. I think that that's where I start to have a problem, when you break up properties, when you divide them between the big and small screen. And I think you've seen Agent Coulson even suffer for this over at Marvel, where sure, people are saying he can do both, but he doesn't really show up in the movies anymore. We haven't seen him make any movie cameos since he started the television show, I believe, and I miss him in the movies, and he's just been relegated to this television show that, quite frankly, isn't working. So, you know, is it cost him his role in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know, on the big screen level? So I'd like to just keep things, I'd like to keep properties to themselves. That's why I think the upcoming Netflix initiative from Marvel is very interesting, because it's self-contained. It's the Hell's Kitchen's heroes, and they're going to have their own Defenders team up. And I think that there's some people have said, well, if these characters are popular enough, do you think you could see them jump to the big screen? I don't think so. I think it's too gimmicky. Like, as cool as Walter White was, if he just showed up somewhere as Walter White, you know, not just Bryan Cranston playing off of the popularity of his work there, I think it would just be weird, and it would hurt the integrity of whatever movie he joined, and also for the Breaking Bad television show. TV is good enough now that I think it can exist just on its own. So that's what I would say. I would say it's all about the story structure and what benefits the most from the episodic nature of television versus the one-offs of a movie, you know, every couple of years continuing the story. Or if Marvel's plan is right and our theories are correct, you know, telling a movie from, you know, they're going to actually merge episodic storytelling with movies, whereas the 2 to 3 movies that come out a year are going to be telling all the same story, just continuing it. That's a fascinating development. We'll see if that takes place, and that could be a bit of a game changer. But right now, and that's why I didn't like the Titans announcement now, or because I felt it took Robin off the board for ever appearing in the movies. So that's what I think, and again, I wouldn't divide properties either. And I have some concerns about Gotham. As cool as Gotham looks, it's going to find itself, I think, fighting with the Batman movies for what is audience's predominant viewpoint of Gotham and the Batman mythos. All right, so that's today's morning movie news. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for your question, Nayor. Thank you so much, everyone. Write down below what you thought of today's top 3 stories, the viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.